Well, it gives me very great pleasure to be able to introduce our distinguished panel today. They're people, all of them have influenced me personally, and I'm sure lots of other theologians and philosophers as well who like to know about science. I'm going to be very brief because we've only got 20 minutes per person. We'll start with Ian Barbour, who is generally credited with being the founder of the interest academically in the interrelation of science and religion, and certainly his Gifford lectures, which were given in 1989, I think, at Aberdeen, gave rise to the book later called Religion in an Age of Science. So I'm very pleased to ask Ian to give his presentation.
Let's see now if we're on that. Yeah, there we are. Well, I think I was the earliest among the panel to give the Gifford lectures, so I've had a little more time to change my mind than they have. But whether or not I have changed more, I will see. I picked out 6 topics here. And if our technology is all working, that one does, yeah, that works. The first topic is a fourfold, let me see, yeah, this is working. These 4 ways of relating science and religion: conflict, independence, dialogue, and integration. Now, we don't need to have that on. Historians often hold that no universal generalizations can be made about science or religion. Great variation is evident among sciences and historical periods. Students should study biographies of particular people in their historical context, and certainly people like John Henry Brooke has done a wonderful job in making that kind of focus. But I do think that a typology can be useful, especially in undergraduate teaching about contemporary views, provided its limitations are pointed out, and it is noted that the differing aspects of a person's thought may exemplify differing types. My lectures looked at scientific theories and religious beliefs. I think today I would give greater attention to the practices of both communities in addition to the more conceptual components. I think I'd also give more attention to world religions than I did there. There have been tensions between nations for many reasons: the history of colonialism, competition for resources, lots of reasons for tensions, but I think religious dogmatism has contributed. We've certainly seen that as one component of recent tensions between Islamic and Christian cultures. Islamic authors have been writing during this period on the creation of the universe, and that's been a very fruitful topic of several conferences I've been at. I think another question of great importance is the nature of scriptural authority, which isn't quite the same. The Quran does not play quite the same place that the Bible does in Christian thought or in Jewish thought. And there's certainly a considerable variation in the way fundamentalism comes out, but that's certainly been one of the continuing issues. Buddhist interest in consciousness and meditation, in brain imaging, the themes of interdependence and transience, and the Dalai Lama just a couple of weeks ago, in receiving the Templeton Prize, put a lot of stress on the Buddhist theme of compassion for all sentient forms. They've been perhaps more ecological in that way than we have. We've drawn such a sharp line between human and other forms of life, whereas I think for them there's a more continuous gradation of forms that we need to be compassionate towards. In China, there has been interest in alternatives to Marxism. The Neo-Confucian views of the social order, search for alternatives, in other words, to the Marxist orthodoxy that was de rigueur under Mao. There's been a recovery of interest in Taoist views of nature. Again, the ecological component in which Taoism stresses the unity of human and natural forms. In India, the religious themes supporting environmentalism have been very prominent. So in all of these other traditions, which I think probably most of us, except Keith Ward, tended to ignore. Keith has been a world expert on Islam particularly, but I think the rest of us, until recently, certainly I myself, have tended to give too little attention to other traditions. The third topic that I have noted is a more specific one. I wanted to focus on one area which I think has been important, and as we just heard from Freeman Dyson, neurobiology and the sciences of the brain are of particular interest, I think, in the coming years and in recent laws. And here are the two possibilities of reductionism and emergence. In reductionism, there is a claim that the laws at any level are derivable from the laws governing the next lower level. Here we're talking about levels of explanation. And that is a claim about knowledge, epistemology, but a claim about ontology, what's going on in the world, that goes with this very often is the idea of bottom-up causality. The behavior at systems at higher levels is determined by the behavior of its components. So I take those to be the central claims of bottom-up causality, either at the molecular level or, in the case of someone like Richard Dawkins, it's the genes that are the all-powerful influence on what goes on at other levels too. Emergence, by contrast, says that the behavior of systems can only be described in terms which are meaningless at lower levels. And correspondingly, that top-down causality claims that the pattern of events at higher levels can have a causal influence on events at lower levels, not by violating their laws, but by providing boundary conditions. I think one of the finest treatments of that appeared just last autumn in a whole issue that George Ellis, who chaired the morning session, edited and wrote a summary conclusion article. Very thorough treatment of, this is the Journal of Interdisciplinary Work that the Royal Society publishes. And he gave a nice summary of the status of emergence in contemporary thought, and with space provided for the critics too. So it's not altogether universally accepted, but I think there's a widespread interest in things that go on at higher levels and that aren't necessarily reducible either in terms of concepts of theories or in terms of causal. Another way of viewing the same issues are the whole part constraints that the late Arthur Peacock, to whom many of us have been indebted, have spoken. Not that the whole determines the part, but that the whole influences the part. George Ellis has particularly talked about the larger tasks that you can deal with by integrating modular subtasks. The lower level laws, as someone I think this morning said, are necessary but not sufficient for higher level acts. And even talking about acts or agents or intentions, a parallel, obviously not the same thing, but a parallel is that the rules of chess restrict possible moves, but don't determine the next move. So there is a selection from among all the possibilities as to what is possible, but then you have to select from among them. I've particularly appreciated a book that came out in 2007 by the philosopher Nancy Murphy and her colleague Warren Brown, who's a psychologist, a book called Did My Neurons Make Me Do It? They draw heavily first from Donald McKay, a very early writer on systems theory, who starts from self-correcting systems with the feedback of information from the environment. And the thermostat, of course, is only one part of that system. You have to have the furnace and the room around it, and someone who has selected the temperature that is the goal of the system, if you want to call it a goal, or the state towards which it tends. Similarly, the brain evaluates behavior in terms of goals, say Murphy and Brown, and in humans, a still higher meta level evaluates the intentions and goals themselves. So that's sort of a meta critique or a higher level critique of the goals. Terence Deacon has talked about long-term memory and symbolic language as the distinctive features of human experience that allow reflection on previous experience and future goals beyond anything that even the smartest chimpanzee or bonobo can achieve. Alistair McIntyre has talked about cultural and personal concepts of the good, acting for reasons and not causes, and personal concepts of the good, and some similar ideas, I think, that have been in Charles Taylor's thought. The Murphy and Brown volume have looked at the neurological conditions for selfhood. What neurological features do you need? Well, you need some idea of selfhood. You need some idea of agency, some idea of narrative unity, because I think we integrate our lives often by the stories we tell ourselves or tell others. And a very interesting feature that we can use imagination in running possible scenarios. We don't have to try out we can use trial and error, but we don't have to do it all by an error that might be risky. We can, in our imagination, carry out the scenario. Well, I won't spend longer, but a lot of interesting features of recent work in neurology. It's strange, perhaps, for someone trained in physics to be more interested even in that area than in the earlier panel on cosmology, because I think for the average person, it's things like evolution and brain studies that come close to home. Not that the galaxies are unimportant, but that's where the action is for average people. Brain imaging shows the effects of drugs and neurological damage on mental activities. So increasingly, the traditional idea of a body-soul dualism or a mind-matter dualism looks problematic. How could two things so unlike communicate with each other? And I think a new idea of an embodied self. The body is not just something tacked on. An embodied and an embedded self, embedded in society, so that I am who I am because of my relationships. And even my mind is the product of, over periods since birth, reaching out and interacting, and not just what was developing in the neurons considered in their own integrity. And I think actually this view is more like the view of persons in Hebrew scripture, where a person is a unified activity of thinking and feeling and acting within a community, not a body-soul dualism, though you get in the New Testament some influence, as much from Greek thought as from Hebrew thought. of a mind-body dualism. So actually, this symposium on how my mind has changed is not how my brain has changed, though that may have happened too. I think when we're talking about the kinds of things that we're doing here, you have to use the concepts of, and as I would say, requiring the neural level, but not determined by it. It's a necessary but not sufficient feature of lower levels. Fourthly, evolution in human nature. Neo-Darwinists hold that evolutionary changes are initiated by mutations or environmental changes. That's where it all starts, a mutation or an environmental change. But it looks now, some changes started with novel behaviors, later reinforced by mutations that favored them. James Baldwin emphasized the agency of organisms. In that respect, it resembles Lamarck, but without the inheritance of acquired characteristics. In other words, the mutation reinforces what has first occurred, not from a mutation. And similarly, selection does a good job of picking out from what's there, but the question is what gets there. Simon Conway Morris from Cambridge has noted that eyes with lenses have arisen independently many times. New forms are limited by built-in structural principles. If evolution were repeated here or on another planet, we should expect intelligent creatures like us, not necessarily in having 5 digits, but like us in the ways that we respond to problems, the ways we respond, because only a certain number of possibilities are present in the, if you want, the landscape or the structure space of embryonic possibilities. Whereas, by contrast, Stephen Jay Gould thinks that it's very improbable that there'd be anything like us on another planet because of chance and historical contingency. So that wonderful talk that Sir Martin gave about the recent work that is beginning to show quite a number of probably habitable, what's the number gotten to, Martin? It's up to probably, oh, he's not here, he was here. How many, is it over, it's well over 100 planets now, is it, would you say?
Yeah, probably millions of the galaxy.
Yeah, well, about 500 Barrow tells us. So nobody knows, of course, and they're getting closer to getting further information. But I think the different perspectives of these two biologists, both of whom are highly respected biologists, give us different answers as whether what we would have any right to expect on another planet. Chimpanzees show intelligence, empathy, some forms of altruism, but if shown 2 piles of candy and rewarded only if they choose the smaller one, they never learn to choose the smaller one. But a 2-year-old child quickly learns how to be rewarded because the child is capable of deferred gratification, and somehow the chimp never, you can go on 100 trials, and the chimp never learns that the way to get his treat is to pick the smaller pile. Humans have a far greater capacity to remember, anticipate, and imagine some scenarios and the consequences of their actions. With abstract symbolic language, they can access information in culture. Richard Dawkins talks about cultural information coming in units he calls memes, and thinks they're similar to genetic information in genes. And I would reply, cultural forms can change so much more rapidly and for so many different reasons that the analogy really doesn't hold. Genesis says we were made in the image of God, and traditionally that's been what's set us apart from all other animals. Our distinctiveness lies, I would say, not in our rationality, as St. Thomas Aquinas and medieval thinkers tended to say, or a distinct immortal soul, as much of Christian tradition has said, but in our capacity for relatedness and love, the image being a reflection of characteristics of God, not something in us, so to speak, taken alone. Lastly, here, or not quite last, process philosophy. How's my time coming?
3 minutes.
3, all right. I have drawn from process philosophy, Alfred North Whitehead and Charles Hartshorne, and process theologians like John Cobb and David Griffin. And I note that 2 of our panelists here, John Polkinghorne and Keith Ward, acknowledge indebtedness through process thought, because if human freedom and atomic indeterminacy imply that God cannot know the future. That's one of Whitehead's themes, and a number of theologians have picked that up. God is not unchanging, but responds to events. And the idea of God not having all the omnis, omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence. Omnipresence you can keep, but omniscience, if the future is genuinely free, or if chance is real, even God can't know the future. So that John Polkinghorne's writing about kenosis, so that it's a qualification of omnipotence. He wants to stress that it's self-limitation, whereas I would say it's more built into the nature of things. They reject the idea that integration at any level, but not aggregates like rocks, have a potential for novelty and creativity and or inwardness. So they don't go all the way with Whitehead, but I think they picked up these themes, particularly temporality and interaction, not the God who is unchanged by what happens in history. Process thought has not been widely accepted in these years. I think it needs revisions, more emphasis on divine transcendence as well as immanence, a better representation of continuing selfhood, despite the fragmentary character of both atomic physics, and which influenced Whitehead, and the fragmentary character of events in the physical world. I think the continuing, and we heard about continuity too. Process thought describes a God of persuasion rather than coercion. A similar theme is found among feminist authors. Monarchical images express dominant male attitudes, and of course theology was mostly written by men until recently. We should seek, as the Holy Spirit does, the empowerment of others from within rather than power over others. That's been a feminist theme, and it's one that I have learned from. Hartshorne talks about various levels being integrated by differing forms of organization, so their characteristics may mark different. So the themes of holism, contextuality, and mutual interaction in process thought, I see also in quantum theory and systems theory, in complexity and ecology, that you have to look at the whole and not just start from the parts. You have to look at the influences, and we've talked about that. So finally, ethical issues. The first volume of my Gifford lectures dealt with religion. The second in ethics, and we were mainly talking at this conference about the religion side, but I think the ethics side has come up already this morning. I lay them out in terms of individual values, which you can see there, and social values, social justice, participatory theory, economic development, environmental values, and then I try to suggest both philosophical ways one can defend each set of values, but also theological support. And here, of course, the big change since I wrote the lectures is the huge spread, nobody could have predicted, of information technologies. And there the ethical issues revolve around how wide the access to the technology is, how much is privacy respected by the way it works, and the very uneven results of social networks in which people, particularly at younger ages, are interacting. So there's a lot of activity, but with how much meaningful getting to know each other. Political impacts, forms of social power, whoever owns the network, whoever runs the company that's advertising. These are, so finally, global warming, coal and oil lobbies promoting doubts about the prediction of experts, I think is remarkable to see. I never would have guessed 25 years ago that the coal companies could so influence public opinion through their advertising as to actually cast doubt on a phenomenon on which virtually all scientists agree that there are serious global warming effects due to human activities occurring, that we need to take that seriously. Well, thank you very much. Let's see, we'll turn this off.
This may seem rather rude, but Ian asked me to stand up when it was time. We did start rather late, so we're keeping to 20 minutes per person. And now John Polkinghorne, well known, of course, to all of us, I'm sure. I might say that I have found John the nicest, most annoying person that I know. And the reason I find him annoying is that not only was he a professor of mathematical physics, which I couldn't possibly be, but he's also as good as, and probably a better theologian than I am, and that's terribly annoying. So his Gifford lectures are in 1992, I think, and were published as The Faith of a Physicist.
93, I think, yes.
John.
Oops. Hang on to that. Can I shut this without doing any terrible harm? Okay, that's even better. Thank you very much. Well, like everybody else participating in this interesting symposium, I'm very grateful for the invitation and for the opportunity that it affords. I made the terrible mistake with my Gifford lectures when they were published of allowing them to have different titles on two sides of the Atlantic. That was a bad mistake. People I've known in North America come to this country and bought the second version and found it strangely familiar when they began to open the book. However, I did have the wisdom to give my Gifford lectures the same subtitle on both sides of the Atlantic, Theological Reflections of a Bottom-Up Thinker. And by bottom-up thinking, I mean a search for truthful understanding which starts from and is shaped and controlled by the experience of actual encounter with the reality under consideration. In other words, it is an a posteriori approach to be contrasted with the a priori approach of top-down thinking, which believes that it possesses prior knowledge of clear and certain ideas that can then be used to regulate analysis of the particulars of experience. Scientists are instinctively bottom-up thinkers. Their exploration of the physical world has often revealed it has highly surprising character, displaying counterintuitive properties which would have been beyond our powers to anticipate without the actual nudge of nature. And of course, a paradigm example is provided by quantum theory, which is the type of physics I worked in during my scientific career. Without the stubborn prompting of nature, no one would have supposed that light would sometimes behave like waves, that's to say, spread out and oscillating, sort of flappy things, and sometimes like particles, like little bullets. Any top-down thinker could, in 1899, have proved the impossibility of such oxymoronic behavior. Yet, of course, as we all know, that's how light actually behaves. And after 25 years of struggle with this strange fact, it became intelligible to the physicists through Paul Dirac's discovery of quantum field theory. And I very strongly believe that theological thinking can be approached in a bottom-up way also. In my Gifford lectures, I took clauses from the Nicene Creed, sought to lay out the evidence that persuades me of their truth. The writers of the New Testament, though they were mostly Jewish and so very strong monotheists, were clearly driven by their experience of the power of the risen Christ in their lives to use divine-sounding language about him. For example, assigning to Christ the title Lord, which really, of course, belongs to the one true God of Israel. Although they knew that Jesus had recently been living as a human being among them, they found they couldn't do justice to their actual experience without this apparently oxymoronic combination of human and divine language. And the duality of humanity and divinity in Christ is, of course, a much more profound and challenging even than the wave-particle duality of light. But my stress would be that, like the latter, it arises from experience, not from rash metaphysical speculation. I think I have to say, and this is perhaps rather a dull thing to have to say, I have to say that I have not seen reason to revise in any very significant way the views I expressed in 1993-94. I hope I've expanded their scope a little bit, even possibly conceivably deepened their understanding a little bit. But essentially, I've remained in the same kind of position. And I think that the importance of bottom-up thinking in theology has in fact become even clearer to us over the years that have intervened since 1993. Today, the shrill polemic of the new atheists proclaims that religious people believe without evidence or even against the evidence. Now, of course, I totally reject this allegation that religious belief requires intellectual suicide. I could not be a religious believer if that were the case. Consequently, I believe it is very important that we should be able to articulate a bottom-up approach to our foundational beliefs, showing that they are sufficiently well motivated to support our committing our lives to them. They won't be demonstrated, of course, beyond a peradventure, but they can, I think, provide the best explanation of very important and significant phenomena. In the science and religion community, if I may so describe it, over those intervening years since my Giffords, there have been two particularly significant foci, I think, of discussion to which I have sought to contribute. The first was the extensive discussion that took place in the 1990s concerning the possibility of, on the one hand, accepting all that science can actually tell us about the causal structure of the world, while still holding fast to theological belief in a God who is providentially active within the unfolding history of creation. In other words, a God who does particular things in particular circumstances. And such a belief, of course, is fundamental to the religious use of personal language about God, even though, of course, we know we are employing it in some necessarily suitably stretched sense. We use such personal language, not, of course, because we think God is an old man in the sky, but because God is better thought of as Father rather than Force. That is to say, as responding appropriately to the particularity of circumstances, in contrast to something like the implacably unchanging action of the force like gravity, which will kill saint or sinner alike if they step off the top of a high cliff. However, in the 18th century, after Newton, many believed that science had disclosed the clockwork character of the universe, whose God, of course, could then be no more than a cosmic clockmaker, and hence the rise of deism in the 18th century. But the 20th century, as you all know, saw the death of a merely mechanical view of the physical world. And this came about by the discovery of intrinsic unpredictabilities present in nature. And of course, the word intrinsic is very important here. These are unpredictabilities that cannot be removed by more precise measurement or exact calculation. They are properties of nature. This fact first came to light in the subatomic realm of quantum physics, and then later, in a different fashion, in the macroscopic everyday realm of chaos theory. Whatever nature is, it is something more subtle than mere mechanism. And then the vital question is it also more supple? Does it have a causal structure which has a degree of openness to its character? Unpredictability, of course, can either be due to a necessary epistemological ignorance, all the factors that actually determine precisely what will happen. We believe that to be the case, for example, with the fall of dice. Or it might be due to the presence of an actual ontological indeterminacy at the level of description being employed. And it turns out that the choice between these two possibilities, the epistemological or the ontological possibilities, cannot be settled by physics alone. But it requires also an act of metaphysical decision. For example, the undoubtedly statistical character of quantum physics, it deals in probabilities and not certainties, can be interpreted in either way, as you probably know. Niels Bohr's Copenhagen interpretation takes the option of actual indeterminacy, in other words, an ontological interpretation. But that clever and ingenious, perhaps at times over-ingenious man, David Bohm, was able to offer an alternative deterministic interpretation. And these two approaches produce exactly the same empirical consequences. So the choice between them lies outside of science itself. The great majority of physicists, I think, side with Bohr, I certainly do, not because he was in the field first before Bohm came along, but because they feel that Bohm's theory, ingenious and instructive as it is too contrived in its character to be meta-scientifically attractive. Now, choosing the indeterminacy option or the openness option in interpreting unpredictabilities does not imply that the future is a kind of random lottery, but only that there is scope for the operation of other causal principles beyond science's canonical account of the exchange of energy between constituents. And of course, an obvious candidate for such additional causal factors would be the acts, the holistic acts of agents. This will be relevant to understanding what I believe to be myself the absolutely basic human experience of a degree of freedom of choice of action. I really can choose to raise my arm or choose not to raise my arm. I know, of course, that's disputed among philosophers. There's practically nothing that isn't disputed among philosophers. And nevertheless, I think that's all sorts of terrible consequences, I think, flow from treating human beings as if we are automata. It not only destroys free will, it also, in my view, destroys rationality. My speaking becomes just the quacking of an automaton. And of course, if that's the case, if there is this open causal structure in the world, opportunity for the exercise of other causal agencies, then it offers scope for the providential action of the creator acting within the open grain of natural creation. And theologically, that option is a much more attractive concept than the notion of occasional divine interference, the divine finger poking into the works of the machine from outside, interference from outside. For that involves the incoherence of the God who is the sustainer of nature having to interfere with the divinely ordained process of nature. An incoherence which, I regret to say, is exemplified by the intelligent design movement. Now, very detailed discussion, I'm obviously just sketching a picture, very detailed discussion of these issues took place in the 1990s. And some of the participants laid particular stress on what they saw to be the possible role of quantum unpredictabilities. Well, I, in fact, tended to lay greater stress on the possible role of chaotic unpredictabilities. Looking back on that discussion, 10 years or so later, I think one could see that in its details, it was at the time over-ambitious. Agency, whether human or divine, is no doubt a very complex process, operating through a variety of interacting levels of the physical world. One could not realistically hope to obtain a truly adequate account at a single level. What that discussion did achieve, I think, was aptly expressed by Ernest Macmillan when he said that it had served to defeat the defeaters. Its value was that it made it clear, through, if you like, thought experiments of thinking about possible role of quantum unpredictabilities or chaotic unpredictabilities, what that discussion did achieve was to make it clear that science had not established the causal closure of the world on its own reductionist terms. One can take with all the due seriousness which it deserves what science is actually able to say about the causal structure of the world without being driven to believe that human beings are automata or that the world's creator is condemned to the role of an impotent deistic spectator of its history. That was one development since my Gifford lectures, largely since my Gifford lectures. The second welcome development in the science and religion thinking over that period has been, I think, greater attention being given to the understandings and challenges offered to the discussion by engagement with theological insight, going beyond the generalities of natural theology by itself. So natural theology is a valuable exercise, I think, looking at the marvelous order of the world, looking at the wonderful fruitfulness of cosmic history that's turned a ball of energy, the home of saints and scientists, raises question of whether there might not be a divine mind and a divine purpose lying behind those remarkable facts. But it leaves, of course, many other questions unresolved. At the very best, the picture it can give you of God is simply a very thin one, picture of God as the great mathematician or the cosmic architect. Better than nothing, but not really quite enough. We need the insights that come from other forms of experience, more personal forms and transcendent forms of experience, and the intellectual reflection upon them. In other words, a move from natural theology to something like systematic theology, in Christian terms anyway. And in relation to that development, I've been concerned particularly with one insight that it provided, one challenge that it provided. The insight is, I think, the promise of Trinitarian thinking. Recently, there has been a considerable revival of concern with the issue of Trinitarian thinking simply within systematic theology itself. And this surely has relevance to science's discovery of the presence of widespread degree of rationality present in the physical world. Perhaps the most remarkable instance of this relationality, there are many instances, but that's the most remarkable instance, is the phenomenon of quantum entanglement. Once two photons have been interacted, they retain a counterintuitive degree of instantaneous mutual influence, however widely they may have separated. Effectively, they behave like us, many ways, like a single system. So it turns out that even in the physical world, even the subatomic physical world, mere atomism is dead. The subatomic world cannot be treated simply atomistically. This unexpected character of nature, its deep-seated relationality, is of course strikingly consistent, it seems to me, with the theological belief that the world is the creation of the triune God, the God whose being is constituted by the perichoretic exchange of love between the three divine persons. Of course, in saying that, I'm not for a moment trying to pretend that quantum entanglement justifies Trinitarian theology. That would be an absurd claim to make. But one might expect that creation would exhibit some pale reflection of the nature of its creator. In science's discovery, the reality is relational, comes as no surprise to theologians who have long spoken of being as communion, to quote the title of a very famous and influential book by the Orthodox theologian John Zizioulas. So that's been developing, and I think there's more work to be done in that area. The challenge to religion that I've been concerned with lies in the fact that every story that science tells ends ultimately in decay and futility. The second law of thermodynamics states that without external interference, the disorder of a system can only increase and never decrease. We all know that we're going to die on a time scale of tens of years, and the universe itself will die on a time scale of many billions of years, most probably by continuing to expand, becoming more and more cold, more and more dilute, till all life must disappear from it everywhere. And do not these facts of inevitable decay and futility challenge the theological claim that the world is a meaningful divine creation? However, science has only one story to tell. It tells essentially, if you like, the horizontal story of the continued unfolding of present physical process. But theology has another story to tell, if you like, a vertical story of the divine faithfulness which will ensure that nothing of good that comes into being will ever be lost. And I believe that the only, and indeed the sufficient ground for the hope of a destiny beyond death has to lie in this divine faithfulness. That's, I think, a belief that science can neither speak for or speak against. It's a different dimension of insight. And it's a belief which, of course, I, as a Christian, believe has been exemplified and guaranteed by the resurrection of Christ within history as the anticipation of the destiny that awaits the rest of us beyond the end of history. But then we might go on to ask the question, can we actually make sense of the idea of a human destiny beyond the death of the body? We have good reason to believe, as the ancient Hebrews in fact did, that we are psychosomatic unities. We are a kind of package deal with the mental and the material in inseparable complementarity. We're not spiritual beings temporarily trapped within a fleshly body. We're not apprentice angels in that sense. Any concept of a destiny beyond death requires, first of all, that there should be some carrier of continuity which will ensure that it's the same human individuals as those who died, who are the individuals who will live again in the new kingdom of God. And of course, in the past, quite often, this agent of continuity was conceived in a way in Christian thinking in a Platonic fashion as an independent spiritual component, the soul released from at death, the entrapment in the fleshly husk of the body. If we are psychosomatic beings, we've lost that concept of the soul. And what could be the soul of a psychosomatic being? Well, I'll have to wave my hands a bit in saying this. I don't have a detailed, worked-out answer, but I think this makes sense to me. But whatever the soul is, it surely must be the real me. Whatever that is almost as difficult, in fact, to conceive in this life as beyond it. What makes me elderly, bored academic today the same as the schoolboy with the shock of black hair in the school photograph of many years ago? The tempting answer is material continuity, but that's an illusion, because the atoms of our bodies are changing all the time. So the continuity of our personhood is not simply due to material continuity of the matter that composes us, for that is an illusion. The real me must be something like, this is where the hand-waving comes in, something like the almost infinitely complex information-bearing pattern which is carried at any one time by the atoms of my body, my memory, my character, and so on, my relationships also. Now that pattern, of course, will obviously dissolve at death with the decay of my body. But it is a coherent theological hope, I believe, that the faithful God will not allow that pattern to be lost, but will preserve it in the divine memory. That will not be preserving me as a person in itself, because if I am to be a human person, I think I have to be embodied. So that pattern will be kept in the divine memory with the intention that God will eventually re-embody it in a final great eschatological act of resurrection. The Christian hope is resurrection of the body, not a tenuous spiritual survival. Now, of course, there would be little point in making people live again in order to die again. So that re-embodiment will have to be in some new form of matter, which is characterized by such strong self-organizing principles that is not subject the thermodynamic drift to decay that characterizes the matter of this world. It seems to me to be scientifically coherent to believe that God could produce such a form of matter as a second stage of creation, which the old creation of decay and death is transformed into the new creation of everlasting life. Now, of course, there's clearly some speculation in what I've been saying, but I think the idea is sufficient to indicate that taking science seriously does not condemn us to the belief that the present universe is ultimately meaningless because of its present bondage to decay. Its true meaning of this present world is that it provides the raw material from which, in the purposes of God, new creation will be brought to be. I believe it is extremely important for the coherence of Christian belief to be able to think in something like this way. I believe that engagement with eschatological issues is probably the most significant recent development in the interaction, the discourse between science and religion. I'll just conclude by making a couple of ad-lib remarks about hopes for the future. I think the most difficult problem facing religious belief is the problem of evil and suffering. I don't need to explain that problem to you. But I think the second most difficult problem for us today, certainly is for me, is coming to terms with the diversity of the world faith traditions. They're obviously all speaking about the same realm of experience of human encounter with the sacred, if you like. And they have some commonality in the things that they say. They all speak highly of compassion. They all, in one way or another, place importance on the significance of mystical experience and experience of union with the one or the all. But in other matters, they really are saying very different things. I mean, what's the human person? Of continuing, abiding significance, as the Abrahamic faiths say, or recycle through reincarnation, or an illusion of which to seek release. And I think the big problem, not just for the 21st century, but probably the third millennium, and Keith has done so much work to help us in this area, is to begin this long and painful dialogue between the world religions. And I think science can play a small role in this, simply as a meeting point, as the religious traditions discuss what they make of modern scientific understanding. My final hope for the future, which I express very quickly, the most neglected part of the frontier between science and religion is the most important part of the frontier between science and religion, which is the human sciences, neuroscience, psychology, and so on. Work is going on there, but not enough, and I hope much more work will be done in the future. Thank you for being patient.
I have to admit, I feel rather like the Grim Reaper putting an end to the most interesting parts of the discussion. But I would like to ask Holmes, Rolston, who is really one of the founding members of the newish movement of ecological philosophy, and his Gifford lectures, which came out, I think, as Genes, Genesis, and God, are an outstanding representative of that movement. Holmes.
Thank you.
Oh.
See if I can just click space bar. Thank you. I do not think my Gifford lectures are among those that prove to be the most memorable, but I do make one claim that probably no other Gifford lecturer has done. I went out and pulled the weeds off Lord Gifford's grave. I pulled the weeds off because you could hardly find the grave unless you pulled away enough weeds in order to see the inscription. So I might commend to the speakers that we'll hear this evening, especially the Edinburgh speaker, see if you can find Lord Gifford's grave. All right, this has gone forward. I want to think about creation as being cybernetic, but also cruciform. I'm thinking about Genesis on earth And it seems to me now this genesis results from searching for new information, a generate and test process that produces a wonderland of biodiversity, biocomplexity, and notable achievements in science, ethics, and religion. But I've also come increasingly to see that these creative processes are cruciform, that, if you like, the music of life is in a minor key. Natural history on Earth, I think, is cybernetic. We've had an information explosion from this marvelous DNA molecule in humans, in plants, and it has produced a marvelous wonderland planet. Well, when I went to school, actually I majored in physics. They taught me there's two kinds of things in the world, matter and energy, but Einstein had combined them. But when I went across the quadrangle, let's see, why didn't that work? Well, we reloaded my program on a different computer and I'm missing part of that slide. When I went across the quadrangle, they said, oh yes, the physicists have got their matter and their energy, but there's something they don't know about. That's information. And here we have John Maynard Smith. Heredity is about the transmission of information. See, now we have the idea that in their coding, the genes have got, well, an end. They're up to something. They are self-actualizing. They're reproducing. They've got an ongoing sharing and an elaborating of biological value and promise. Well, there's information on the moon in the sense that a good geologist can say, this meteor crashed on top of this one and so forth. So in that sense, you can read information in outer space, but it's only on Earth as we know it at present, though as Martin Rees and others have said, maybe we'll learn that this process is happening elsewhere. Only on Earth that we have a sort of vital, proactive information, right? That's how to communicate, elaborate various vital structures and processes. It's directed use, and this information escalates over evolutionary history and crosses some critical thresholds. It's not just, however, information which is in the individual organism now that we're seeing as being a rather sophisticated information system. James Shapiro, University of Chicago, says, as a matter of fact, the evolutionary processes are sophisticated information processing systems. And they surprisingly often use co-option, where they take a gene that evolved, the product of a gene that evolved for one function, and switch it over to doing something radically different. Heat stress proteins turned out to be crystalline, you could see through them, and so they are used in many kinds of eyes. Darwin knew this already. The swim bladder helps lazy fishes to float, but it turned out to be converted into lungs for life on land. And if you think about the mitochondria and the plastids, the mitochondria are the power molecules in our cells. They crisscrossed over in the pre-plant animal line, or if you think about chloroplasts that harvest energy from the sun, they crisscrossed over. So you get these kind of, surprising, serendipitous adventures in evolutionary natural history. Well, evolutionary natural history is cybernetic, but I think also, obviously, the human mind is a cybernetic process. There have been changes in bodies from primates to humans, but I'm more interested in what's going on in that head, in which there's a radical increase in brain volume. In relatively recent millions of years, Ed Wilson says, no organ in the history of life has grown faster. Michael Gazzaniga, neuroscientist, says the differences are light years apart. Right? So now, in some sense, the cybernetic processes take on dramatic new possibilities in the human form of being. We've got about 3,000 times the cortex of mice. We've got 3, maybe 4 times the cortex of chimps. If you could spread out the axons and dendrites in your mind, it'd be a pretty thin thread, but it would wrap around Earth 40 times. Seth Grant says the most complex protein structure in the body, with about 1,200 different kinds of proteins, is the postsynaptic side of the synaptic connections. All right? This adds up to a huge possibility space. Now, we might have 10 to the 27th power atoms in our brain. I pick up from time to time that there may be 10 to the 80th power protons in the visible universe. But now, if you look at sort of the permutational possibilities inside your head, it's 10 raised to whatever that is, 70 trillionth power, right? That's a lot of thinking space, isn't it? How are we different? Well, I think we've come to put it often in this language. We have a theory of mind not otherwise present in animals, at least not in our form and degree. Daniel Povinelli, anthropologist here, the theory of mind that chimps don't have. All right, what's the theory of mind? The idea now is that we pass ideas from mind to mind to mind. And you might think that, well, that helps us survive, and indeed it must help us survive, but we do lots of things with this mind that doesn't have any obvious survival capacity. A few years ago, Perelman discovered a proof now to the famous Poincaré conjecture, which has to do with transforming one kind of space into another kind of space. We don't really think that had anything to do with his leaving more children in the next generation. It probably prevented it. Ed Wilson, who does think that our genetics determines much that happens in our culture, still spends a lot of time studying ants, in which he finds splendor in minute proportions. I don't think that's helping Ed either to leave more children in the next generation. See, now we've got humans with a transcending capacity to look at the ants, right? To think about unusual proofs in mathematics. In that sense, we can orient ourselves wondering about the big questions as we are doing this minute. We can create ideologies and creeds and defend our rights and responsibilities. In this sense, we are remarkably distinct from the other sorts of species. Now I want to say this cybernetics generates what? It generates caring. All right, now we're getting a move from sort of information to the capacity to move around in the world and to get hurt and to get helped, right? Things make a difference, and you don't survive unless you attend to these needs. So I'm saying that the complex cybernetic processes produce a world in which caring is augmented and increases. There's caring wherever there's agency, wherever you've got to move around, wherever you've got something in your environment that you need to find. And this produces, irritability in all forms of life, but with sentient life, you get the capacity to move around in the world and to get what you want, but also to get hurt if you don't get what you want. And so now a neural animal has got to love something and seek it, and we get the appearance of felt caring. Goings on become going concerns. Martin Rees, others up in the skies, they have to wonder how we get maybe created things out of nothing. But on Earth, creation involves struggle. It involves labor. To be alive is to have problems. Anybody want to contest that? Things can go right, they can go wrong. Now I want to say that nature is intelligible. We have logic of life, but that becomes a pathetic form of life. So life is prolific, rich biodiversity, but that has to be generated in creative struggle. We get now the evolution of caring, of suffering, of values that matter. See, now I'm seeing a kind of inevitable connection between life on Earth and its search for new information and its increasing capacities to suffer. I'm seeing in natural history new life rising out of old. There's a transformative character of suffering, right? Dying, living onward again. So I want to say now that Darwinian natural history, with its death and regeneration, with its life as a struggle for survival, echoes classical religious themes. The biologists are going to say life has to be conserved again, generation after generation after generation. Theologians will say life has to be perpetually renewed, perpetually redeemed. Biological nature is always giving birth. It's always in travail. And that's a seeming evil, but Earth bears again a new crops of life, new forms of life with each new generation. And I do not think that in a world without pain and without hurt, anything like these great dramas could have come to pass on our Earth. A world without blood, perhaps if possible, a world with plants only, would be poorer, but a world without bloodshed, predators eating prey, right? Would have no legs, would have no arms, would have no ears, and it would be less rich in biodiversity and less divine. The way of nature is a way of sorrows. I continue that in human life, where it seems to me that incarnate minds navigating a large possibility space will have to come to explore the various possibilities in caring, in loving, in justice. Right? So we're going to have to develop sympathy, and we're going to be beset by fears and challenges in a world that's ambiguous and challenging. I think that's a biblical model. You've got to be chosen by God, but to suffer and be delivered from suffering. Israel, the very meaning of the word, is a limping people who have wrestled with God. And Jesus, the divine Son, is a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Divine Logos becomes incarnate in the language of John, but the divine Logos can become fully incarnate only in suffering love. Now I want to think that this does not make the world absurd, but it's a key to the whole, a transformative principle in which creative genesis must suffer. And I recall that this capacity has emerged on earth. I see it as a kind of essence of Christianity, but now I see that the whole evolutionary genesis is a kind of calling in which new life comes by blasting the old, in which life is a blessed tragedy lived in grace through a besetting storm. All right? In that sense, the creation is godly not because of struggle, not in spite of it, but because life persists in the midst of its perishing. Light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. So there's Logos, there's story, there's cross, there's glory. History and nature are a via dolorosa. The aura of the cross, as I see it, is cast backward across the whole of life on earth, and it forever outlines the future. All the creatures are forever being sacrificed that life may continue in generations to come, like the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. In that sense, earth is a land of promise, but it has to be died for. Creatures since the beginning have been giving up their lives, a ransom for many. I see Jesus not as the exception to the natural order, but as the chief exemplification of it. Tragic beauty is the law of the narrative. Thank you.
Finally, Charles Taylor is probably one of the best respected philosophers of today, and in my view, anyone who can write a book on Hegel which is partly comprehensible deserves that reputation. But he is best known probably for what became his Gifford lectures, A Secular Age, and also Sources of the Self, many other works too, so great pleasure. In case you're worrying, this will be 20 minutes, and then there will be 10 minutes for question and answer after that. Charles.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you very much to the organizers for this opportunity. Well, my Gifford lectures happened, I think, the most recently of all the other participants happened in 1999, and I was extraordinarily lucky. If I'd been more disciplined, less confused, better organized, I would have published or tried to publish it much earlier, and I'm sure it would have disappeared into the nether background. But it come to pass, is it providence or is it luck, that this was the center of a big discussion. And I want to try to explain why, what was moving in the intellectual culture that opens up a whole lot of new directions, because I think this is really very interesting. It's really that the pace of exploration of certain issues that are now open, you had to get rid of some of the wrong issues in the past to open them, is really quite remarkable. So let's look at it from several points of view, but start off with this point of view. So the book is aimed at the old secularization thesis, which very simply put would be modernity puts an end to religion, or broken down a little bit better, the various developments people think of as modernization. Examples are science and technology, urbanization, greater social mobility, the development of the state, development of the market economy, all these, you can lay all these out. That the different variants of the secularization theory take one or many of these developments and say that they have as an inevitable consequence the decline of religion, religious practice, and religious belief. And one of the big problems with this thesis, apart from the fact that it doesn't fit the facts in many cases, is that it's incredibly oversimple about history, because these big kind of changes, when you get from ages of faith to ages of what we think of as secularity, they have to come about partly through very, very large-scale changes in how people understand themselves, understand what it is to be an agent, understand what it is to be part of a society, understand what it is to be existing in a larger nature and cosmos. And these processes can't simply be explained by simple unilinear causal relation between one aspect of the society and the other. Now, the luck in this, for me, is that dissatisfaction, deep dissatisfaction with the old secularization theory was already building up. It was building up to a certain degree of heat, or whatever the word is, degree of intensity, so that the book had an interesting impact. People said, well, now look, this is somebody who's offering another view. Maybe it's all totally wrong. Probably it is in many ways wrong. But it's changing the subject. It's not simply refuting the old stuff. It's giving another alternative. So we got off in a new direction with new discussion. I have to say, the fact that the culture had got that way, there are a lot of people who were in this before me. I'm thinking Marcel Gaucher's wonderful Le Désenchantement du Monde. There are a lot of things that I could mention that existed before, but nevertheless, it did coincide with this cultural change. Now, how does this open up new directions? I want to mention several, because they all seem to be coming together. But it opens up, of course, new discussion about just what did happen under this title, secularization. Exactly what went on, what the process was. And there's lots and lots of discussion and disagreement about that. But I want to move on to look at another aspect of secularization theory in its traditional form, and ending which also opened up a tremendously interesting domain. The old secularization theory like the old theories of modernization that it was a part of, that it belonged to, were universal. That is, the idea was there is a single process we can call modernization, moving through the world. Now, of course, the lucky civilization, the European and the West, was first into the slot, but others are moving along behind. So you get this picture, human history as this big caravan in which Europe and America are leading, and sort of way back there, the two camels that are wandering in the wake, but they're all heading in the same direction. Now, that too was building up a lot of dissatisfaction. Right? And we got the beginnings of a discussion of what people called multiple modernities. Shmuel Eisenstadt is somebody to mention here because he's one of the pioneers of this notion that, yes, there are plural modernities. That is, there are developments in institutions in different cultures and civilizations that are very close, very analogous to each other. I mean, again, as I mentioned earlier, development of modern bureaucratic state, of market economies, of science and technology, and so on and so on. But the, if you like, cultural underpinnings of these, the way in which they arise, the cultural resources that they take on and change in order to actually start developing in different societies are so different that we have to think of modernity not simply as a single process involving institutional change and cultural change, but as something refracted in different ways in different civilizations, in India, in China, in Japan, and so on. And I wrote the book very much with this multiple modernities idea in mind. That's why I deliberately restricted the book to looking at what I call Latin Christendom and some of its successor, only some of its successor societies, because I thought there was a dynamic here which wasn't the same at all as what you find in other cultures. Well, this opens another very interesting avenue or set of avenues, the avenue of comparative understanding of, do we want to call it secularities? I mean, the analogous type developments in other parts of the world obeying quite different dynamics. And I think the book contributed to that because I just so single-mindedly gave a portrait of what I thought was happening in one culture. And I've had very gratifying reaction from, for instance, Indian colleagues who are saying, it's great, I read your book, and it's not true here at all, right? So we began to think, well, what is true there? And then we get a new kind of debate, a new kind of development, all right? So let's go on from this. How do we come to grips with this kind of comparative study of secularization, or whatever you want to call it, in China and India and so on, in comparison to the West? Well, very soon, a very strong conviction arose among a lot of people working on this, that one of the keys to understanding this is to go back to the age of the great axial revolutions. We go, as you know, Karl Jaspers put this forward in a very popular book then at the end of the Second World War, the idea that there are very similar changes occurring in all civilizations, and roughly, he thought, the same time, roughly 500 BCE or around then, in which you see a really far-reaching change in, if you like, religion / metaphysical outlook, and which are both rather similar, surprisingly contemporaneous, but also importantly different. And this insight rose and fell, or disappeared under the waves, until once again, and I think Shmuel Eisenstadt is a very important figure here, not accidentally, somebody interested in multiple modernities, began to bring it back, and there have been very good discussions on this. The interesting question is, what is similar between these great changes? I mean, roughly speaking, Plato and Greek philosophy, in the Greek case, Hebrew religion, beginning to develop the idea of the true religion in Hebrew civilization, Upanishads and the Buddha in Indian civilization, roughly Confucius and others in Chinese civilization. So what is the common element and what are the differences? And here it's very interesting, a debate is starting. Shmuel himself thought he introduced this notion of transcendence. But I think my take on it is somewhat different. It's rather of the following kind, that pre-axial religions were very concerned with the care and tending of the gods, I mean, what the Romans called, establishing a relation to sacrifice, the peace of the gods. It really means the peace of the gods in relation to us. And the goal sought in these rites was something like human flourishing of a quite unproblematic kind, which we can all understand. I mean, that the crops not fail, that there not be famine, that we have many children, that we manage to flourish. At the same time, the higher elements involved, the gods or spirits, which relationship with which was meant to secure this, were not seen as unreservedly in favor of human flourishing. There were some that were rather contrary. There were some that had to be a little bit convinced to get on our side. You had a Wotan figure, but you had a Loki figures as well, and so on. So this is an interesting combination of rites that are meant to secure human flourishing, and but in a world of the divine where it's not a priori on your side. What you see, I think, arising in all the great axial moves is an understanding of a higher kind of good, and this can be expressed in terms of a relation to God, or in terms of nirvana, or in terms of the idea of the good, or in terms of proper God, the human-heartedness, and so on. A higher kind of good, which is really universal, and which goes beyond flourishing in one or other way. It may just totally go beyond anything defined in ordinary human flourishing, such as certain notions of salvation, but even if it doesn't go beyond in that way, it certainly goes beyond human flourishing of our group, which is what most pre-axial religion is concerned with. It has a universal element and something like a higher notion of good. And this involves a parallel or related change, that what is now considered the divine or the highest principle in the universe, or whatever, however you define it, is seen as unreservedly in favor of and promoting human good, this higher good, right? So there's a real mutation. And I think you can see in the great successor civilizations a combination of this new kind of devotion, which usually entailed the development of individuals going off in elite paths, be they bhikkhus or monks or philosophers or sages and so on, alongside in a large society, public cult that retains some of the same goals as the pre-axial cults. And you get, Louis Dumont talks about l'individu hors du monde, the idea of an individual that moves outside the world to a kind of higher type of devotion or discipline. So the question, I think that's the common point. The interesting thing is the differences. But I could go on and on about this, but I mustn't step beyond the 20 minutes, particularly everyone wants to have questions and then perhaps a drink or something. So let me say that this is, we're still obsessed by this. A very good book is coming out, edited by Hans Joas and Robert Bella. A very good book has been written by Robert Bella on this entire issue of the axial ages, the religious evolution. And that opens up another new chantier, we say in French, another new sort of area of possible work, which comes out in the title of this great book by Bob Bella, Religious Evolution. People now looking at the evolution of religion as a whole. I mean, in other words, looking at the evolution of human beings in the light of, or the evolution of religion as being a crucial feature of their lives, or if you like, the evolution of religion in the light of the evolution of human beings. In a certain sense, there are different axes that you can use to cut into this from different angles. Think of humans as the cultural animals, humans as the religious animals, homines religiosi, or you can look at human beings as the language animals. Now, I've been particularly interested in this. I'm trying to work on this. But take it on any axis. Let's take it on that axis because I'm happier with that. And there, too, we find some remarkable new developments. I think one of the most important are that we really have stepped beyond a kind of atomism of understanding of the human mind and particularly of human language, the kind of atomism we get with Cartesianism, and which comes out in theories of language where they are, like Hobbes or Locke or Condillac, where language is meant to record thoughts and then communicate thoughts. I dress my thought up in these words and I send it to you and you take it in and you get the point. Whereas what people are seeing more and more, I'm thinking of writers like Tomasello and others who are working on this issue on ontogenesis, is that you get this extraordinary situation where language in its inception is not in the individual mind at all. I mean, just think, we're programmed, I suppose, genetically to be able to see properly, and therefore when the infant gets into the world and begins to explore, the capacity of sight develops and they can make sense of the world. Nobody develops language that way. I mean, that's what the 18th century thought, that kids in the wilderness would say, hey, that's an idea, let's call this tiger or something. But never the way it happens. You're inducted into a language in a, that's very clear, in a really loving relationship of closeness. Right? Without that, it doesn't work at all. So in a certain sense, there's a kind of communion which is at the basis of the development of human language. And I think this is where John Polkinghorne was touching on something. I think you were saying that. Yeah, exactly, that this is, if we want to talk about humans made in the image of God, maybe that is an absolutely crucial dimension of why humans are in a certain sense in the image of God that other animals are not. And you could even argue that, as against what were in the earlier generation, very, I think, fertile thinkers like George Herbert Mead, who at least tried to get over the very atomistic focus of earlier theories of ontogeny and said, well, after all, my sense of myself is very influenced and formed by what I'm seen as in the terms of my parents or the significant other. It's actually much more radical that you could say that the very conception, very understanding of myself as a self grows up from within this very close relationship I have with those around me, in which that's the space in which language moves, so that it's a kind of secondary development. There's very interesting experiments about this, a kind of secondary development to develop a clear idea of here's where I stand, and that's where mom stands, and that's where dad stands, and that's what little brother sees. If they test these kids, you get these where you give them a box where it looks as though there are Smarties inside. So the kids open the box, and there are pencils. It's very disappointing. But then, okay, so they put these kids to one side, and they bring new kids into the room, and they give the new kids the boxes, and then they ask the first kids, what do those new kids think is in the box? And the answer is pencils. I mean, it has a certain age in which you begin to figure out that, of course, those poor kids are thinking Smarties, but are they ever going to get a terrible disappointment? But the world is seen from a single point of view, if you like. And we all know that it's pencils, so they think pencils. In other words, the very possibility of the individuation as an ego comes out of that original chrysalis. So there are really fascinating issues. How close am I to jumping over what? I'm there. All right. Well, I was ready. Anyway, you see that a lot of very interesting things are opening up, and that's very exciting for me. Thank you very, very much. I'm so.
Well, very, very rich afternoon, and a very good complement to this morning in that we moved into areas of philosophy and social theory and wider theological implications. So we just have a little time for questions, if there are any that you'd like to ask. Let's wait a little while for people who haven't spoken before, if we could.
Yeah, Mr. Arniger, and retired lecturer. I preach Christianity on internet. Now, Christ Jesus, when he died on the cross, the curtain of the holiest of holy was torn apart, telling people to have direct approach to God. And Christ Jesus was anointed royal high priest. So in Jesus, we are royal priest. So what part these priests in churches play when we are royal priest and we are not hireling?
So I wish I had the answer to that question, but maybe it might take several questions.
Yeah, I think thank you for that. Let's take some more questions at the same time, since we have so little time. Yes, John.
Could I ask all of the panel what they think has been the impact of the professionalization of academic study on the kind of reflections that you're interested in? Why I ask that question is because in the period of the foundation of the Gifford lectures, it was characteristic of the sorts of people who gave those lectures that they had a kind of breadth of comprehension. They were interested in a kind of integrationist projects of various sorts, and that reflected the times in which they lived as well, and so on. But what characterizes academic life today, increasingly, is a high degree of specialization, and the trajectory of careers, if I can put it that way, means also premature specialization, and indeed even niche marketing of ideas, that you just work in a narrower and narrower area from an earlier and earlier stage. And what I'm struck by is that listening to you all, I mean, the reach has been extremely interesting and impressive in a way. But does that leave you, maybe this is just too large a question to ask, I mean, how does that leave you looking at, from within your own fields, I mean, perhaps each of you might speak to that, looking at the prospect for this kind of inquiry in the future, when, you see rising generations specializing at earlier and earlier stages in narrower and narrower fields? How could they begin to kind of engage with and comprehend the sorts of questions that you each in your own way have tried to deal with?
Yeah.
Well, I think you mentioned a real problem. I mean, there is a tremendous pressure to become the expert on the tiniest piece of matter. And I think the sort of intrinsically interdisciplinary topics we've been talking about this afternoon provide some antidote to that. And those of us who onto the position where being worried about tenure or whatever, I mean, how should, to take advantage of that, I think.
I think there's a lot of counter tendency to specialization because problems have gone global. And specialists don't solve global problems, for example. Or they become more complex, as we've heard several times, and specialists aren't good in their little academic niches at solving complex problems. I've had a lot to do with environmental conservation, and the first thing you know is that you don't solve saving endangered species by becoming a specialist in what the rhinos eat. You need to know that, but you need to know all of the social forces that are causing these species to be threatened. So I see as much movement sort of away from specialization as realizing that problems have to be understood in a more inclusive and comprehensive complex than they ever did before.
I would agree with Holmes on the need for that kind of more holistic view, but I think the universities, both on our side of the Atlantic and yours, are organized around very fragmented disciplinary lines. A lot of schools talk a good interdisciplinary line, but promotions and firings are done by how much you've published in a technical journal. I think there are certainly lots of possibilities. There are interdisciplinary journals. I always tell a student who comes to me to ask, how do you study this kind of thing? You really have to have credentials in one field, then you can reach out to another field. But science and religion is being taught quite widely, both in UK and US, but usually by people who have a foundation within a department.
No, Ian said what I wanted to say, yeah.
Yeah, I just add that I think today's occasion has been a wonderful overview of both sciences and arts, fellows of the Royal Society and under the British Academy, and maybe it's the old C.P. Snow thing of humanities and sciences, really. It just happens that religion and science is one place where that conversation can take place. We're coming towards the end now, but let's have a final question.
May I address Professor Rolston in his a remarkable address. Do you see in the heroic tragedy of human life no development, no evolutionary development? So this tragedy just continues on endlessly until the end of the world.
I'm not sure, sir, I have your question. Do I see in the human mind no sense of tragedy? I see a great sense of tragedy in possibility. If the humans are the one species so far to threaten the integrity of the planet, for example. So there's great possibility for good and evil in the human mind, but in my way of thinking, they are symmetrical. You can't have great powers for good without simultaneously having great powers for evil. It seems to me that's in my tradition, a biblical lesson, but it seems to me that's a lesson you easily learn in watching the modern world, that the capacity for technological development can be used to kill as quickly as it can be used to save.
So you do not feel there is an evolutionary
Evolution.
possibility of growth in moral good?
There is some possibility of growth in moral good. I grew up in the U.S. South. We did eliminate slavery, and we have a black president now, which we would never have dreamed of in some times past. We have minimum wage laws. We have generally protection against people starving that's been built into our system. In my lifetime, women have come to occupy major positions they could never have occupied before. I see that all as signs of moral progress, yes. At the same time, I see that the acute value questions of good and evil are as sharp and as painful as they have ever been in human history.
This reminds me slightly of a comment that Martin Rees made on a different occasion, that we could evolve into super intelligent moral agencies, but we may well exterminate ourselves next year. It's a very Lutheran approach, I think. Well, at this point, I think I should thank the John Templeton Foundation for making this possible and the British Academy for hosting the occasion. And I think it's the sort of meeting that can only further the cause of good, rounded education. And thank the speakers this afternoon, who I think have given us enough provocative comments to take us well through dinner. Thank you very much.